Chicago in 1670. A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1. The Land Before the City. Wilderness and Waterways. A World Without Chicago. In the year 1670, the place that would one day become Chicago did not exist as a city, a settlement, or even a trading post. No European had yet set foot on this particular stretch of marshy shoreline. At the southwestern corner of the great inland sea, the native peoples called Michigami, the Great Water. This was a world 3 years before the first French explorers would pass through, a world where the land belonged entirely to the Native American peoples who had called it home for thousands of years. What existed in 1670 was something far older and far wilder than any city. This was a landscape of extraordinary strategic importance. A place where waterways from two different drainage systems came tantalizingly close together, where a short portage could connect the Great Lakes to the vast Mississippi River system and thus to the Gulf of Mexico. This geographic accident would eventually make Chicago one of the world's great cities. In 1670, it made this place a crossroads for the native peoples who understood its significance long before any European mapmaker drew a line upon it. The name Chicago itself would come from the native peoples, likely from a word in the Miami, Illinois language, Chicaquah, meaning wild onion or wild garlic. These pungent plants grew abundantly in the marshes around the river mouth, their smell powerful enough to define a place. In 1670, the wild onions still grew thick in the wetlands, their scent carried on the wind that blew off the Great Lake. This was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a homeland, traveled, hunted, and understood by peoples whose ancestors had lived here since the glaciers retreated over 10,000 years earlier. To call it wilderness is to see it through European eyes. To the Illinois, the Miami, and the other peoples who knew this place, it was simply home. The geography of the future city. The landscape that would become Chicago was shaped by water and ice. The great glaciers of the last ice age had carved the basin that held Lake Michigan and had deposited the flat, low-lying plain that stretched away to the south and west. When the glaciers melted, they left behind a geography perfectly suited for human habitation and transportation, though unsuited for the kind of city that would eventually rise there. Lake Michigan dominated the eastern horizon, a freshwater sea so vast that the opposite shore was invisible. The lake moderated the climate, keeping summers cooler and winters warmer than the interior. It provided fish in abundance: sturgeon, whitefish, trout, and countless other species. It served as a highway for canoes, connecting the peoples around its shores and linking them to the other Great Lakes and to the St. Lawrence River route to the Atlantic. The Chicago River flowed into the lake through marshy lowlands that flooded seasonally. This river had two branches, a north branch and a south branch, that converged near the lake. The river was sluggish, its current gentle, its waters brown with sediment. It was navigable by canoe for several miles inland before becoming too shallow or choked with vegetation. The crucial geographic feature was the portage. A few miles up the south branch of the Chicago River, the land rose slightly, and a short overland carry of just a few miles connected these waters to the Des Plaines River, which flowed into the Illinois River, which flowed into the Mississippi, which flowed to the Gulf of Mexico. This portage, sometimes dry, sometimes a muddy slough, sometimes a continuous water route during spring floods, was the key to everything. Whoever controlled this portage controlled a route across the continent, the prairie and the marsh. Beyond the immediate lakefront and river valley, the landscape opened into vast prairies, seas of grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction except east, where the Great Lake glittered. These prairies were not the empty plains that later settlers would imagine. They were carefully managed landscapes, shaped by fire, and maintained by the native peoples who understood that burning the grass encouraged new growth that attracted the game they hunted. The tallgrass prairie in 1670 was a world of extraordinary biological richness. Big blue-stem grass grew higher than a man's head by late summer. Wildflowers in season created displays of color that astonished later European visitors. The prairie supported vast herds of bison, the great shaggy beasts that provided food, clothing, shelter, and tools to the peoples who hunted them. The marshlands around the river mouth and along the lakeshore were equally rich. Waterfowl in numbers that would later seem unbelievable nested and fed here during their migrations. Muskrats, beavers, and otters inhabited the waterways. The wetlands produced wild rice, cattails, and other plants that supplemented the diet of the peoples who lived here. The forests that bordered the prairies and grew along the waterways provided timber for canoes, lodges, and tools. Oak, hickory, maple, and other hardwoods supported their own communities of wildlife. The edge zones where prairie met forest were particularly productive, offering the resources of both ecosystems within easy reach. Climate and seasons. The climate of 1670 was slightly different from today's. The Little Ice Age that had begun around 1300 was still affecting global temperatures, making winters somewhat colder and more severe, but the basic pattern was the same: hot, humid summers, cold, snowy winters, and the dramatic seasonal transitions that characterize the continental interior. Winter brought bitter cold, with temperatures dropping well below zero when Arctic air masses descended from the north. The lake froze along its shores, and snow accumulated on the prairies. This was the lean season, when survival depended on stored food and successful winter hunting. The native peoples knew how to survive these winters, but they were nevertheless dangerous. Spring brought the great thaw, with flooding along the rivers and marshes. This was when the portage was often easiest. High water could turn the overland carry into a continuous water route. The waterfowl returned in vast numbers. The prairie began to green. Summer was the season of abundance. Crops could be grown, fish were plentiful, game was fat, the long days allowed for travel and trade. Summer was also the season of warfare, when raiding parties might venture out against enemies. Fall brought the harvest and the great hunts. Bison were at their fattest, their hides at their best. Waterfowl migrated through in tremendous numbers. This was the time to prepare for winter, to dry meat and fish, to store corn and other foods, to prepare lodges for the cold. Chapter 2. The People. Native Nations of the Region. The Illinois Confederation. The dominant Native American presence in the region around what would become Chicago in 1670 was the Illinois Confederation, or Illiniwek. The people. This was not a single tribe, but an alliance of closely related peoples who shared a common language and culture. The principal tribes of the Confederation included the Kaskaskia, Peoria, Tamaroa, Cahokia, and Michigamia, among others. The Illinois peoples spoke an Algonquian language closely related to that of the Miami and other Great Lakes peoples. Their territory extended from the southern shores of Lake Michigan down through the Illinois River Valley and beyond. The Chicago area was at the northern edge of Illinois Territory, a borderland where they interacted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not, with their neighbors. The Illinois were primarily an agricultural people, though hunting, fishing, and gathering remained essential to their survival. They grew corn, beans, and squash in the river bottoms, where soil was rich and water available. Their villages could be substantial, with populations of several thousand gathered in the larger settlements, but the villages were not permanent in the European sense. The people moved with the seasons, following game and visiting different resource areas through the year. By 1670, the Illinois were under increasing pressure from enemies to the east. The Iroquois Confederacy, armed with European weapons obtained through trade with the Dutch and later the English, was expanding westward, raiding and displacing other peoples. The Beaver Wars, fought primarily over access to the fur trade, had destabilized the entire Great Lakes region. The Illinois would suffer greatly from these conflicts in the decades ahead. The Miami people. The Miami were closely related to the Illinois, speaking a similar Algonquian language and sharing many cultural practices. Their territory overlapped with the Illinois in the Chicago region and the exact boundaries, if such a concept even applied, were fluid and contested. The Miami were known for their skill as traders and diplomats. They occupied a strategic position between different European spheres of influence: the French in Canada, the English in the Atlantic colonies, and eventually the Spanish in the Southwest. This position allowed them to play different powers against each other, extracting advantages from all. In 1670, the Miami were also feeling pressure from the Iroquois Wars. Some Miami groups had retreated westward into Wisconsin and beyond, seeking safety from the devastating raids that had depopulated entire regions. Others remained in their traditional territories, attempting to maintain their position despite the dangers. The Miami would later become the dominant Native American presence in the Chicago region, particularly the Potawatomi, who were Miami allies. But this shift was still in the future. In 1670, the complex movements of peoples in response to the Beaver Wars were still unfolding. Other peoples of the region. The Great Lakes region in 1670 was home to numerous other peoples, whose territories, trading networks, and political relationships intersected at places like the Chicago Portage. The Potawatomi, whose name meant people of the place of fire, were closely related to the Ojibwe and Ottawa. In 1670, they were primarily located further north and east, around Green Bay and the western shore of Lake Michigan. Over the coming century, they would migrate southward, eventually becoming the dominant native presence in the Chicago region. Their descendants would be among those forced westward on the Trail of Death in the 1830s. The Ojibwe, or Chippewa, were one of the largest Native American nations, with territory stretching from the upper Great Lakes westward to the northern plains. They were French allies and active participants in the fur trade. Some Ojibwe bands had connections to the Chicago region through trade and kinship networks. The Fox and Sauk peoples lived to the west, in what is now Wisconsin and Iowa. They were rivals of the Illinois and would fight bitter wars with the French in the early 18th century. Their presence shaped the political landscape of the entire region. The Menominee inhabited the lands around Green Bay. The Winnebago, Ho-Chunk, lived in southern Wisconsin. Each of these peoples had their own relationships with the Chicago region, whether through trade, alliance, or conflict. The Iroquois threat. Looming over all the peoples of the Great Lakes region in 1670 was the threat of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Five Nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, had become the dominant military power in northeastern North America through their alliance with first Dutch and then English traders who supplied them with firearms. The Beaver Wars, which had begun in the 1640s, were primarily about access to beaver pelts for the European fur trade. The Iroquois had exhausted the beaver populations in their own territory and sought to control access to the still rich hunting grounds of the Great Lakes region. Their military campaigns were devastating, destroying entire peoples and forcing others to flee their homelands. By 1670, the Iroquois had already dispersed the Huron, the Erie, the Neutral Nation, and others. Their raids reached deep into the Illinois country, bringing death and captivity to villages far from the Iroquois homeland. The peoples of the Chicago region lived with the constant threat of Iroquois attack, shaping their settlement patterns, their alliances, and their daily lives. The Iroquois threat would eventually recede as French military intervention, disease, and the depletion of beaver populations reduced their power. But in 1670, they remained the dominant concern for every native nation in the region. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Survival and Community. The Village and the Seasons. Daily life for the native peoples of the Chicago region in 1670 was shaped by the seasons, by the availability of resources, and by the social structures that organized labor and distributed its products. Life was not easy, but neither was it the constant struggle for survival that some later writers imagined. These were peoples who had mastered their environment over thousands of years. The Illinois and Miami lived in villages during the agricultural season. These villages could be quite large. European visitors in the following decades would describe settlements of hundreds of lodges housing several thousand people. The villages were typically located along rivers, where soil was fertile and water available for crops. Housing was substantial. The Illinois built large structures covered with bark or woven mats that could house multiple families. These lodges might be 50 or more feet long, with a central corridor and sleeping areas along the sides. Fires for cooking and warmth burned in the center, with smoke escaping through openings in the roof. But the village was not the only residence. Through the year, people moved to different locations to exploit different resources. Winter hunting camps were smaller, occupied by individual families or small groups pursuing game. Summer camps might be established near particularly good fishing spots. The portage site itself was likely a seasonal gathering place, where people came together for trade and social purposes. Food and subsistence. Agriculture provided the foundation of subsistence, but hunting, fishing, and gathering remained essential. The combination of these strategies provided both security. If one source failed, others could compensate. And dietary variety. Corn was the primary crop, grown in varieties adapted to the short growing season of the northern prairies. The Illinois planted corn in hills, often with beans that climbed the corn stalks and squash that spread across the ground between them. The famous Three Sisters planting that provided complementary nutrients and helped maintain soil fertility. Women did most of the agricultural work, from planting to harvest. They also gathered wild plants. Berries, nuts, roots, and the wild onions that gave Chicago its name. This gathering was not random foraging, but systematic exploitation of resources whose locations and seasons were intimately known. Men hunted and fished. Bison hunting was the most dramatic and dangerous pursuit, requiring cooperation among many hunters. Individual hunters pursued deer, elk, and smaller game. Fishing provided reliable protein, especially in spring when runs of spawning fish offered easy harvests. Food preservation was essential for winter survival. Corn was dried and stored. Meat was smoked or dried into jerky. Fish were similarly preserved. These stored foods, supplemented by winter hunting, sustained communities through the cold months. Material culture and technology. The technology of the native peoples in 1670 was sophisticated, adapted over millennia to the specific challenges of their environment. Though lacking metal tools, except for native copper, which was cold-hammered rather than smelted, they had developed technologies that met their needs effectively. Stone tools remained important. Arrowheads, spear points, and cutting tools were fashioned from flint and other fine-grained stones. The skill required to produce these tools was considerable, and particularly good stone might be traded over long distances. Bone and antler provided materials for awls, needles, fish hooks, and other implements. These were particularly important for working leather and producing clothing. The bones of large animals were also used for tools like hoes. Wood was shaped into a vast array of objects: canoes, lodge frames, bows, bowls, and countless other items. The birch bark canoe was the essential transportation technology for the waterways of the Great Lakes region. These vessels were light enough to be carried over portages, yet sturdy enough for substantial loads. Hides provided clothing, shelter coverings, and containers. The processing of hides was laborious work, primarily performed by women. Tanning transformed raw skins into supple leather, suitable for clothing and other uses. Pottery was produced for cooking and storage, though it was less common than among more sedentary peoples. Baskets and bags woven from plant fibers served many of the same functions. Cordage, rope and string of various sizes, was essential for everything from snares to canoe construction. Social organization and gender roles. Illinois and Miami societies were organized around kinship networks that determined relationships, responsibilities, and rights. Both peoples traced descent through the male line, patrilineal, though they recognized relationships through both parents. Clans. Groups tracing descent from a common ancestor. Organized social life. Marriage was typically outside one's own clan, creating networks of relationship that crossed community boundaries. These kinship networks provided the framework for political alliance, economic cooperation, and mutual support. Gender roles were clearly defined but complementary. Women controlled the agricultural sphere, planting, tending, and harvesting crops, as well as processing and cooking food. They also gathered wild foods, processed hides, made pottery and baskets, and maintained the household. Men hunted, fished, made war, and conducted diplomacy with other peoples. They cleared fields for planting by girdling trees and burning brush, built canoes, and produced weapons. Leadership positions were typically held by men, though women's influence was exercised through the kinship networks that shaped political decisions. Children learned by observation and participation. Boys accompanied men on hunts from an early age. Girls learned women's skills from their mothers and grandmothers. Formal education in the European sense did not exist, but knowledge, practical, social, and spiritual, was systematically transmitted across generations. Chapter 4: Trade, Travel, and the Wider World. The Portage's crossroads. The Chicago Portage was not merely a local convenience, but a point of continental significance. Control of this route meant the ability to move goods and people between the Great Lakes Basin and the Mississippi drainage. Between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, the native peoples who used this portage understood its importance long before Europeans arrived to exploit it. In 1670, the portage connected worlds, goods from the Atlantic coast. Shell beads, copper, and European trade goods that had begun to filter through existing networks could pass through here on their way south and west, products of the southern regions, including some goods that had come up the Mississippi from the Gulf, could move north to the Great Lakes. The portage was a node in a continental trading system. The physical portage varied by season. During spring floods, it might be possible to paddle canoes the entire route, with only brief wading through shallow stretches. During dry seasons, the carry might be several miles over ground that could be muddy or dusty depending on recent weather. The portage was never truly difficult, but it represented effort. And that effort gave value to anyone who could facilitate passage. Native peoples who controlled key portages could exact tribute from travelers, could facilitate or obstruct movement, could profit from their strategic position. The Chicago portage was valuable enough that multiple peoples might claim rights to it, and conflicts over such control were possible. Trade networks. Trade among Native American peoples was ancient and sophisticated. Long-distance exchange networks moved goods across thousands of miles, connecting regions with different resources and allowing peoples to obtain what their own territories did not provide. The Great Lakes peoples traded extensively with each other and with peoples far beyond. Copper from the Lake Superior region was valued throughout eastern North America. Shell from the Gulf and Atlantic coasts moved far into the interior. Obsidian, found only in specific volcanic regions, traveled hundreds of miles from its sources. Trade was not merely economic, but social and political. Trading relationships were typically embedded in kinship connections, real or fictive. Trading partners were allies. The exchange of gifts reinforced relationships and created obligations. Trade was diplomacy conducted through the movement of goods. By 1670, European trade goods were beginning to reach the Chicago region, though no European had yet visited. Metal tools, glass beads, cloth, and other items moved through native trade networks, passed from hand to hand until they reached peoples who had never seen a European. These goods were valued and sought after, changing in subtle ways the balance of trade and power among native peoples. The French approach. The French had established themselves in Canada over the previous half-century, building a colonial presence based on the fur trade. From Quebec and Montreal, French traders, missionaries, and explorers were pushing westward and southward, seeking new sources of furs and new peoples to convert. The Great Lakes were becoming known to the French. Samuel de Champlain had reached Lake Huron in 1615. French missionaries and traders had followed, establishing relationships with the Huron, Ottawa, and other peoples. The devastating Iroquois attacks on the Huron in 1649 had temporarily disrupted French expansion, but by 1670 they were probing further into the interior. The French interest was primarily in beaver pelts, which could be sold at great profit in Europe for the production of felt hats, but the French also sought political alliances with native peoples, hoping to build a network of allies that could resist English and Iroquois power, and French missionaries sought souls, hoping to convert the native peoples to Christianity. In 1670, the French knew that a great river lay somewhere to the south and west, flowing to the Gulf of Mexico. They had heard of it from native informants. They would soon send explorers to find it. Louise Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette would pass through the Chicago portage in 1673 on their way to and from the Mississippi, but in 1670, this was still in the future. Warfare and diplomacy. Relations among native peoples were not uniformly peaceful. Warfare was an established part of life, though it took forms very different from European warfare. Raids, ambushes, and small-scale conflicts were common. The great battles that characterized European wars were rare. Warfare served multiple purposes. Revenge for past injuries was a primary motivation. A killing required response, and feuds could continue across generations. Capturing prisoners was another goal. Captives might be adopted to replace deceased relatives, might be enslaved, or might be tortured to death. Raiding for horses, in later periods, or material goods, added economic incentives. The Iroquois Wars had introduced a new dimension to native warfare. The scale and intensity of Iroquois attacks, and their access to European firearms, made them devastating enemies. Peoples who had lived in relative security found themselves facing destruction. The survivors had to choose: fight, flee, or submit. Diplomacy offered alternatives to warfare. Alliances could provide security against common enemies. Marriage connections created kinship bonds that discouraged conflict. Trade relationships built mutual interest in peace. The sophisticated diplomacy of native peoples, with its ceremonies, gift exchanges, and carefully chosen words, allowed for the peaceful resolution of many disputes. Chapter 5: Spiritual Life and Worldview. The Sacred World. The spiritual life of the Illinois, Miami, and other peoples of the Chicago region permeated every aspect of existence. There was no separation between sacred and secular, between religion and daily life. The world was alive with spiritual power, and humans needed to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual beings that inhabited it. The sun was often regarded as a principal deity, the source of light and life, but the spiritual world was populated by countless other beings. Spirits associated with animals, plants, places, and natural phenomena. These spirits could help or harm humans, depending on whether proper respect was shown to them. Animals were especially important spiritually. The species that peoples hunted for food were also beings with their own powers and purposes. A successful hunt required not just physical skill, but the spiritual preparation and proper treatment of the animal killed. Failure to show respect could result in hunting failure or other misfortune. Dreams and visions provided access to spiritual power. Young people, especially boys, might seek visions through fasting and isolation, hoping to receive spiritual guidance that would shape their adult lives. The beings encountered in visions might become personal guardians, sources of power that could be called upon throughout life. Ritual and ceremony. Ceremonies marked the important transitions of life and the cycles of the year. Birth, naming, puberty, marriage, and death all required appropriate ritual observance. The agricultural calendar was punctuated by ceremonies. Planting, first fruits, harvest. That acknowledged spiritual dimensions of subsistence. Some ceremonies involved the entire community. The Calumet ceremony, centered on the sacred pipe, was particularly important for diplomatic occasions. The offering and sharing of the pipe created bonds between peoples and invoked spiritual sanction for agreements made. The French would participate in Calumet ceremonies as they established relationships with Great Lakes peoples. Shamans, or medicine people, served as intermediaries with the spirit world. They possessed knowledge and power that allowed them to diagnose illness, identify the causes of misfortune, and prescribe remedies. They might lead important ceremonies, or provide guidance on spiritual matters. Their powers were respected, but also sometimes feared. The dead required proper treatment. Burial customs varied among peoples, but the underlying principle was consistent. The dead continued to exist in some form, and needed to be sent properly to the afterlife. Grave goods might accompany the deceased, providing what they would need in the next world. Knowledge and oral tradition. All knowledge in 1670 was preserved and transmitted orally. There was no writing in the European sense, though pictographic symbols could convey certain kinds of information. The accumulated wisdom of generations, practical, social, spiritual, was carried in the memories of living people. Oral traditions included many types of knowledge. There were stories explaining how the world came to be, how things got their characteristics, and how proper behavior was established. These stories were not mere entertainment, but teachings that conveyed essential truths. There was practical knowledge of where to find certain plants, how to make tools, when to plant and harvest, how to predict weather. This knowledge, accumulated over millennia, was essential for survival. It was transmitted from elders to youth through observation, instruction, and practice. There was social knowledge. Who was related to whom? What obligations existed between families and clans? How disputes should be resolved? This knowledge ordered society and maintained relationships that made collective life possible. There was spiritual knowledge. The proper ways to address spirits, the meanings of dreams, the requirements for ceremonies. Some of this knowledge was available to all, some was restricted to those with particular roles or training. Relationship with the land. The native people's relationship with the land was fundamentally different from European conceptions of property. The land was not something to be owned, but something to be used, shared, and respected. Rights to use particular resources in particular places might be recognized, but the idea of absolute ownership that excluded others was foreign. The land was alive, inhabited by spirits that required proper treatment. To use the land was to enter into relationship with these spirits. The first fish of a catch, the first fruits of a harvest, the first game of a hunt might be offered back, acknowledging the gift and maintaining the relationship. Boundaries between territories were often fuzzy or overlapping. Different peoples might use the same areas for different purposes or at different seasons. The Chicago portage itself was probably such a shared space, used by multiple peoples who recognized each other's rights to pass through. This relationship with the land would be fundamentally challenged by European arrival. European concepts of property, European demand for furs, European agricultural practices, all would transform the relationship between people and land in ways that the peoples of 1670 could not have imagined. Chapter 6. On the Eve of Contact. The World in 1670. The year 1670 marked a moment of transition, though those living through it could not have known it. The European presence in North America was expanding, and the ripples of that expansion were already affecting peoples who had never seen a European. Within 3 years, the first French explorers would pass through the Chicago portage. Within a generation, the entire region would be transformed. In 1670, the French were consolidating their position in Canada. The fur trade was flourishing. Missionaries were active among many Great Lakes peoples. French explorers and traders were probing ever further into the interior, seeking new sources of furs and new routes to the rumored Western Sea. The English were established along the Atlantic coast, from the Chesapeake Bay to New England. They had recently taken over the Dutch colony of New Netherland, renaming it New York. The English would prove to be the most serious competitors to French expansion, but in 1670, their attention was focused on the Atlantic seaboard. The Iroquois, allied with the English and recovering from smallpox epidemics and French counterattacks, remained a formidable power. Their raids continued to threaten the western Great Lakes peoples. The balance of power was shifting, but the Iroquois were not yet defeated. Changes coming. The changes that European contact would bring were already beginning, even before Europeans reached the Chicago region. The trade goods that filtered through native networks were creating new desires and new dependencies. The firearms that the Iroquois possessed were changing the nature of warfare. The diseases that Europeans carried were spreading along trade routes, killing people who had never seen a European. European diseases would prove the most devastating. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses against which native peoples had no immunity would kill millions across the Americas. Some scholars estimate that 90% or more of Native Americans died from European diseases in the centuries following contact. The peoples of the Chicago region had not yet experienced the worst of these epidemics in 1670, but they were coming. The fur trade would transform native economies and societies. Peoples who had hunted for subsistence would begin hunting for trade, depleting animal populations, and becoming dependent on European goods they had previously done without. The trade would bring benefits: metal tools, cloth, guns, but also dependencies that would ultimately undermine native autonomy. The missionaries would challenge native spirituality, seeking to replace ancient beliefs with Christianity. Some native people would convert, others would resist. Most would engage in complex negotiations between old and new beliefs. The spiritual world of 1670, with its rich interconnection of humans, spirits, and land, would never be quite the same. What would be lost? The Chicago of 1670, the marshes, the prairies, the forests, the waters teeming with life, would largely disappear in the centuries ahead. The bison that grazed the prairies would be driven to near extinction. The passenger pigeons that darkened the skies would become completely extinct. The beaver, otter, and other fur-bearing animals would be trapped out. The prairies would be plowed, the marshes drained, the forests cut. The peoples who had lived here for millennia would be dispossessed. Through treaties, wars, and forced removals, they would be pushed ever westward, their populations decimated by disease and conflict. By the 1830s, the last native residents of the Chicago region would be forced across the Mississippi, their homeland taken for white settlement. What the native peoples knew, their understanding of this place, its resources, its spirits, would be largely forgotten. Some knowledge would survive, preserved by descendants who maintained their identities despite everything, but much would be lost, as the old people died, and the young learned different ways in different places. What would remain? Yet something would remain. The name Chicago itself would persist, a native word on a city that the native peoples did not build. The routes they traveled, the portage, the waterways, would become the routes that Europeans followed, and eventually the routes of roads and railways. The strategic importance they recognized would be confirmed by the great city that would rise at this place. The wild onions that gave Chicago its name would be driven from the marshes they once filled, but the name would endure, a reminder that this place had a history before the history that most people know. The Chicago of 1670, native, wild, balance between peoples and between worlds, would give way to something utterly different, but it was here first. The story of Chicago properly begins not with the first European explorers, not with Fort Dearborn, not with the city's incorporation in 1837. It begins thousands of years ago, when the glaciers retreated and the first humans arrived in this place. It continues through 1670, when the Illinois and Miami and their neighbors lived their lives here, as their ancestors had done. Their Chicago, their Chicaaqua, was the foundation on which everything else was built.